appointed to the Senate in 2009 to fill the vacancy created when Ken Salazar became Secretary of the Interior. His education level was a bachelor's degree in history from Wesleyan in Ohio and a law degree from Yale. After working in the private sector as managing director of Anschutz Development, is that Anschutz? Yeah. Moving to Colorado, then Mayor of Denver, John Hickenlooper, took an interest in him and named him his chief of staff. From there, he became superintendent of the Denver public school system. He entered the presidential race in May, becoming the 7th member of the Senate to jump into the field. He has a very unique background in that he was born in New Delhi, India, where his father was working for the State Department. So we're going to go from there.
And by the way, if you do want to yell at me, you can, because I was an urban school superintendent, so you can't hurt my feelings. Don't worry about it.
All right, first question, we're going to jump right into the most obvious one. Does Donald Trump deserve to face impeachment? And if you think so, please detail what you see as the specifics of his high crimes and misdemeanors.
Well, I think it's perfectly appropriate that they've opened an impeachment inquiry. No president I'm aware of would ever have admitted doing what the president admitted the other day when he said that he had asked the Ukrainians and the Chinese to interfere in our elections. And I think it's not surprising to me that yet another whistleblower has come forward today. This is changing every single day. So I don't think we should prejudge this, but I think it's important for the inquiry to have been opened. And I'm hopeful that all of us, whether we're elected officials or whether we're Americans, will use this as an opportunity to try to restore our democracy, no matter what the outcome is. I remember well Watergate. I was young at the time, but it was on TV all day when I was a kid. And that was a very dark time in American history. We had the Vietnam War going on, and we had what Nixon was doing in the White House. And we came out of that whole period much stronger than we went into it. And when the politicians actually came together in a bipartisan way to stand up for the rule of law and to stand up for the democracy, it elevated all of us, I think. And so I'm hopeful that however this process turns out, that it'll yield the beginning of the restoration of our democracy, which I believe is at real risk right now.
You serve in the Senate with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who has said that if the House passes an impeachment resolution, he has acknowledged that they are mandated by Senate rules to take it up, although he said the timing could be up for some debate. You know, no Republican senators so far, other than to some degree Mitt Romney, have really expressed any openness to this process. Do you think there's anything that could get them to change their minds on impeachment? And do you see any way in which, you know, a majority of the Senate could come around to moving forward with that?
I hope if they come to the conclusion that the rule of law has been broken and that the Constitution needs to be protected, that will be their guide. But I don't want to prejudge it. I'm not surprised they aren't prejudging it. You know, when this whole process started with Watergate, very few Republicans came out and said that Nixon ought to be impeached. It wasn't until a year into it or more that people began to understand, based on the facts that were developed, that there were impeachable crimes and misdemeanors. And so I know there's this temptation for everybody to want to put the cart before the horse, but I think it's important for us to go through this process, in part because the American people deserve to have this done in front of them in the light of day, and they deserve to come to a conclusion about this remedy as well. I will say, by the way, Jamie, that I am glad that Mitch McConnell said that he had to bring this to a vote in the Senate, and I wish that he had felt the same way about Merrick Garland, who was President Obama's nominee for the Supreme Court, who never had the opportunity to have his hearing or be voted on by the United States Senate in front of the American people. In my judgment, that was the single most dastardly thing that anybody has done in the 10 years that I've been in the Senate, and is one of the reasons why I've become so worried about our democracy, because once the people up there just do whatever it is they think they can get away with politically, instead of following what the Constitution tells us, we're lost. You know, we become ancient Rome at that point, and that's the risk that we're running right now as a country. It's very, very serious. And apparently he didn't think he could get away with with not having a vote, and that's why he said what he said, but I'm glad he did.
We're in October 2019. Obviously, there will be an election in November 2020. Does there get a certain point where it doesn't make sense to keep moving with that and just wait for the election?
I think it's already, look, we're already 4 or 5 months away from the first contest. I mean, we're going to have to figure out how to walk and chew gum at the same time, but we've got responsibilities to do as Americans, and I'm confident that we will fulfill those responsibilities. The citizens of this country will, and that in the end, the politicians will.
4 years ago, when the Republicans were here, we kept on hearing a lot that they wanted to dismantle the Department of Education. Every one of them piled on when that was happening. What is your position on that? I mean, why do we need a federal Department of Education in the United States versus Republicans saying it should be a state issue? And when you become president, what role will the department have in your administration?
Well, when I become president, I'll have an important role. Sorry, is that all right? First of all, it doesn't have a meaningful role as long as Betsy DeVos is the Secretary of Education, and that's the reason why we have to put a new president in there. And I am the last person, having been a school superintendent, who believes that much of the decision should be made in Washington. I don't believe they should. I spent a lot of time when I was superintendent wondering why everybody in Washington was so mean to our kids and to our teachers, and I went back there and I realized they're not mean, they just have absolutely no idea what's going on in the schools and classrooms in this country. In the universe, there is not a farther place away from our schools and classrooms than the United States Senate. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean that literally. They just have no idea. I think the reason for the federal government to be involved is the civil rights impulse that's very, very important when it comes to making sure that we're having quality public education everywhere in this country, which we're not, and we're not in South Carolina. I've learned enough about that to know. And I believe that since I believe that the civil rights role is so important, it's going to be a combination of trying to incentivize governors and school superintendents and mayors to come together and say, look, we need to admit to ourselves something that's hard to admit, which is our existing education system is reinforcing the income inequality we have in this country, not liberating children from it. It is a headwind on our economy, not the wind beneath our wings, as it was during the middle of the 20th century. And it is a complicating factor, as you're pointing out, that different levels of government have different responsibilities here, but we have used that as an excuse, I think, to maroon children in a system that's not serving them well, and to not pay teachers what they deserve to be paid as professionals. Everybody's pointing in opposite directions, and as president, what I would like to do is bring all those folks together and start to drive us forward into the 21st century. We're living in the 18th century at best when it comes to our education system. And so I would just add one other thing. This wasn't your question, but I'll use it as an opportunity to say, if you went out to America and asked America today, what does the Democratic Party stand for on education? The answer you would get back is free college. And as a school superintendent, I can tell you what I want for people in America is free preschool for every single kid in America who needs it, which is every single kid in America. And we need an answer, thank you. We need an answer for the 70% of kids that graduate from high school today in South Carolina and in Colorado who are consigned to earning a minimum wage because we have not taught them what they need to earn a living wage. We can do that. There's no reason we can't do that in high school and make sure that when kids are graduating, they can actually make a real contribution to themselves and to the economy. Those two issues, universal preschool and that, have been completely lost in this Democratic primary. And I can only think, I hate to say it, but I think the reason is that preschool kids don't vote. And therefore we don't tend to pander to preschool kids in the way we do to other voters in this country. That's just a theory.
I was with you several months ago when you toured parts of what is known in South Carolina as the Corridor of Shame. Parts sort of to the northeast and the southwest of Columbia, where schools have been some of the worst in the country. And South Carolina does have some great schools, but the inequality is very pronounced in this state, perhaps more than some others. You have a background in education policy, obviously, as superintendent of Denver schools. But was there anything during that trip that you learned that you didn't already know? And what do you think, sort of following on from the question you just answered, the federal government can do in a Bennet administration to assist areas?
So I was, Clarendon County, I think, is where we were, and I was absolutely staggered to the degree that the people up there, we had a meeting, you were there, right, for the meeting, and by the way, you guys did an unbelievable series on education in South Carolina. I've read every single word of it, and I'll tell you, it matters a lot. When I was superintendent, I went to the editors of what were then our two newspapers. We've now lost one, tragically, but the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post. And I said to them, look, I've just become the superintendent of schools, and I've read all of your coverage from the last 4 years. And your coverage is terrible. Your coverage covers the terrible scores on the test that we get once a year, but never covers anything else, except occasionally when there's some sort of criminal thing that happens or whatever else. And my point was not that we were doing well, we were failing, but I wanted them to cover what we were trying to do in our reform of the system. And they came, they took tours of the school districts, they read the plans that we wrote, they supported some things and didn't support other things, but they treated it like it was the important public policy issue that you have treated it, and it made a huge difference. So I want to say congratulations on that. And what I learned in Clarendon County was a couple of things I'll share with you. One was the degree to which the people there feel completely let down and isolated by the politicians in the state legislature in South Carolina. I'm not from South Carolina. It's easy for me to say that. There might be other reasons why, but they feel completely ignored by the politicians in the legislature. And you pointed out, or the writers did in your series, that about 25% of the legislators in South Carolina send their kids to public schools. That might have something to do with the fact that they have absolutely no idea what's going on in the public schools, or what you'd want to do if you were actually going to set out to fix it. The most heartbreaking thing that I learned was at the very end of that meeting, there were two sisters whose families had been involved in the Briggs case, which was the desegregation lawsuit here that actually predated Brown versus the Board of Education. I think it was consolidated into Brown. If any knowledge is wrong, it's because I read it wrong in the Courier, or in the Post and Courier. But these women, were friends with, their families brought these suits and others brought the suits. People's houses were burned down up there because of this. They had to move out of the state. These two women, their houses weren't burned down, but they had to move out of the state, both of them. And they'd just come back to live here and to retire here. And one of them said to me, I came to your meeting because I wanted to tell you that the schools here are worse than they were 70 years ago when we filed this lawsuit. That they're more segregated than they were 70 years ago when we filed this lawsuit. I met with a guy yesterday who's the husband of a school superintendent here in South Carolina, who told me the story of graduating in 1972 from high school, but right before that the schools were integrated. His school was, the African American school was turned into a middle school, the other high school, which was the white high school, was turned into the high school. He said the day we all showed up for school, our junior year, when it was integrated, all the white kids left. And so there's a lot of work for us to do. We need to confess what's going on out there, and we need to understand that in a world where some kids get preschool because they're lucky to be born to the parents they're born to, and others don't, that equal isn't equal. And when some kids have high quality K-12 education because their parents earn a good living and they can live in a neighborhood with good schools, equal isn't equal. And when kids have access to high school counselors and guidance counselors and all the rest, equal isn't equal. And when you've got this legacy of segregation and racism on top of it, it shows we have even more work to do. That's why I proposed something called the American Family Act, which would dramatically increase the child tax credit in the United States of America. It would reduce childhood poverty in America by almost 40%. It would end $2 a day poverty in America for kids. It is actually an education reform agenda because it's about putting kids in the position to not be poor so they can get a decent education, and it would cost 3% of Bernie's Medicare for All and not add a single federal bureaucrat to the federal bureaucracy. These are the kinds of things think we should be focused on instead of free this and free that and what constituency can we pander to? What can we actually do to drive change for those people in Clarendon County who have been fighting for change for 70 years, for hundreds of years? Sorry, that's what I learned. There's a lot to learn.
Well, it kind of builds into our next question because looking at the numbers, South Carolina's population is 20% African American. The voting population in the Democratic primary is going to be better than 60% African American. You come from Colorado, 4% African American population. How do you break into those neighborhoods and to those voices and to those audiences from that far away?
I would say this, I doubt very much there's been another Democratic candidate for this office who's been to Clarendon County and met with the people there to listen to them tell the stories about their education system. And the reason that I was there is that as a school superintendent, I worked for kids who were majority kids of color and kids living in poverty. And there were a lot of people who said, what does this guy know about any of this? How can you put it, he doesn't know anything about K-12 education, and he's not a kid of color, and he's not, didn't grow up poor. But we worked intently together for the 5 years that I was superintendent. Every single night, almost, I spent in a school or in a neighborhood in our school district, very often being yelled at for the stuff that I was doing, but doing it because we had to find a way to take a district where the kids were failing, not through any fault of their own, but because of what we had done to them for decades, and try to move it into something else. And just a month or so ago, Stanford University came out with a study that said that today in the Denver public schools, when they compare the growth rates of the kids academically there to the kids around the state, it's the equivalent of the kids in Denver having 60 additional school days a year. That's a third more school days a year than the kids in the rest of the state because of the work that we've been doing there. So I have found traveling Colorado, particularly in African American communities, that there is deep, deep concern about our education system. And it has been a very useful calling card for me. Now, finally, I'll say this too, South Carolina, like everywhere, I think, it's my view that the kids that I used to work for in Denver have exactly the same dreams that I had when I was a kid. And that their parents have exactly the same dreams for them that my parents had for me, and that Susan and I have for our 3 daughters. And I believe in that. So I think whether people are African American or Latino or white, in general, what they want is the same thing for their families, and in general, what they want is the same thing for this country, which is why it's so despicable that we have somebody in the White House who earned the White House by dividing the American people rather than to seek to unite the American people. Somebody who's trying to hold on to his job in the most despicable way by dividing us instead of trying to unite us, and we need a president that will do that.
We're going to talk about healthcare. You mentioned in one of your answers a couple minutes ago that some of your opponents have been offering free this and free that, and one of them has been Medicare for All. You have not supported Medicare for All, and I wanted to ask you, what your aversion to that is economically, philosophically, and what you would like to do instead.
Well, let me start with the instead first, because I think I have a better idea. And as Bernie says about Medicare for All, I wrote the damn bill on the public option. It's called Medicare X. It's something that I've been fighting for since we passed the Affordable Care Act. I always believed that the Affordable Care Act was incomplete because we did not have a public option. It is my view that in 3 years, we can get universal health care in this country by giving everybody in America the choice to have a public option administered by Medicare if they want, or keeping their private insurance if they want to do that, by auto-enrolling people that are eligible in Medicaid and kids into CHIP, which is the insurance program for kids. We'd be done. That's it. For universal coverage, that's all you need to do. We still have a huge issue with costs on healthcare, which is actually what the American people are freaking out about, because more of them are covered because of the Affordable Care Act. although they are worried that Trump, is the first president in American history to actually take insurance away from millions of people. We still have the significant cost issue. And Medicare for all, I just think it's terrible policy and terrible politics. It's terrible policy because it's asking the American people to replace root and branch our entire healthcare system with Bernie's view of what our healthcare system should be. America's not ready for that. And the politics of it are, it's as simple as this. And these aren't Republican talking points. Sometimes Elizabeth Warren says when you're critical of this, she says it's Republican talking points. These are Bernie's talking points. And the reality is he makes illegal all private insurance in this country except for cosmetic insurance. And he says it's going to cost somewhere between $31 and $33 trillion, which he says you should be okay with because you're already paying that in premiums. So why don't you just pay it in taxes? For an order of reference, do you know how much $31 trillion is? It is 70% of all the revenue that we're going to collect as the federal government for the next 10 years. Does anybody here think that the American people are going to support that plan? It's not going to happen. And as a Democrat, as a progressive Democrat, I'll say that here in South Carolina, I don't want to spend the next 10 years in a losing battle on Medicare for all. I don't. I'd rather get universal health care for everybody through a public option. I'd rather pass the American Family Act and reduce childhood poverty by 40%. I'd rather work on education so it is actually liberating people from their circumstances. I'd rather deal with climate change. And we're not going to be able to do that if we're fighting this losing battle. And by the way, we won't be able to win states like mine. The only way that you can win, you're not going to win Colorado being for Medicare for all. We have a Senate race there right now, and in Iowa, and in Maine, and in North Carolina. So Bernie couldn't even get this passed in Vermont once people saw what the taxes were going to be. So I admire his ideological commitment to it. I understand it. Unlike many other candidates, he actually tells the truth about what's in the plan, which I appreciate, I'm grateful for. But I think we spent much too much time in this election talking about Medicare for all and not talking about the things that the American people really need for us to do to move the country forward.
All right, this is an audience question, and it's just delivered very neutrally. What is your position on charter schools?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for applauding. It's a good question. So every state is different, and I would never impose my view of what schools should look like because, as I said earlier, I don't think it's for the federal government to make these decisions. In the case of Denver, we did have a number of charter schools, and I went to this charter school folks because we had a very permissive charter statute in the state. And I went, and the charter school guys came to me and they said, we want to replicate schools in the Denver public schools. And I said, the only way I'll agree to that is if what we're replicating is the high quality charter schools, and that you will help me put out of business the low performing charter schools, because back then we had a lot of low performing charter schools. And that's what we did. And in Denver, as a result, there are a number of schools that are charter schools. Some of them are among the highest performing schools in the school district. We have more secondary students in non-charter school seats in Denver than we did when I became the superintendent. So in other words, we've added a whole bunch of schools and kids at the same time that we've had charters. A lot of places that worry about charters worry about them because they drain kids off of the system. That didn't happen in Denver because Denver was the chartering authority, and we took our responsibility seriously in ways that Betsy DeVos does not. Betsy DeVos's world of charter schools is one where you just have choice and nothing else. There's no accountability. There's no, in Denver, you can't open a charter school and not have special ed kids in your school. You can't open a charter school and not have English language acquisition kids. You can't open it in a suburb and just take the wealthy kids. Most of the kids that are in our charter schools are kids in poverty whose parents are desperately looking for another opportunity. So I think the last thing Democrats should be doing is standing for a moratorium on charters. But at the same time, I don't think they're the solution. What we have to do is reform the entire system of public education in this country, starting with, as I said earlier, the way we pay teachers. We're still paying teachers as if we were living in an economy that's discriminating against women and saying to them, look, you only have two professional choices. One's being a teacher, and the other one is being a nurse. So come teach Julius Caesar every year for 30 years of your life, and we'll pay you a ridiculous salary that no one else in your college class would ever accept. But if you make it 30 years, we'll give you a pension you can retire on, which sounded pretty good because your spouse was going to die. That's our system today, and it won't work. It won't work. You know, the teachers that are now going on strike around the country and are reminding us that if we don't pay people like the professionals that we are, we're going to lose them. And we're already losing 50% of our teachers in the first 5 years of the profession.
No, I think it's you're okay. I will.
I'll make my answers briefer because I don't want to filibuster.
The latest Winthrop poll here in South Carolina shows you are polling at 0% among South Carolina Democrats. Nationally, you're not getting that kind of traction either that you need to get up into the squabble. Why haven't you had your moment yet?
It hasn't come yet. Today there was a poll that had me at 1% in South Carolina. So, and the most recent national polls have me at 2%. You know, I really am polling very low, but there are people on the debate stage who I'm out polling at this point, which in my mind shows how idiotic the DNC criteria were to begin with. And I don't have the national profile that some of these other candidates know, and that's okay with me. I've always run from behind, always. Colorado is exactly 1/3 Democratic, 1/3 Independent, 1/3 Republican. It is a very hard state to win. I've won it twice. I'm the only candidate in this race that's won 2 national elections in a swing state like that. So I think over time, I'm going to continue to make progress. And what's been interesting to me is you've got the people that are best known, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren up there at the very top, and then Bernie, and then basically it's everybody else. You can find Mayor Pete on the way down to where the rest of us are. So I haven't had my moment, and we're going to keep chipping away. I had to make a decision about how to spend my resources because they're not unlimited, and I've decided to use them to communicate first with the voters in Iowa to see if I can make some progress there instead of using it to launder money on Facebook to buy $1 contributions for $70 worth of money that I've raised, which is the crazy system that we have. So it's still early. South Carolina hasn't begun to make up its mind. Iowa and New Hampshire never make up their mind until last month.
You mentioned money, like you read our minds about what we were going to ask about. You announced you raised $2.1 million in the third quarter. It's less than Andrew Yang, it's less than Marianne Williamson, folks who've never run for office before. It's about the same amount as Jamie Harrison raised here in South Carolina just for a U.S. Senate race. Do you have the resources to stay in this race until the South Carolina primary?
Well, obviously, anybody who'd like to make a contribution, we'd like to have a contribution, but that's my hope. I mean, we're running an insurgent campaign. We're running a really lean campaign. We're living off the land, and that's been done before. My friend Gary Hart, who was, once running for president from Colorado, some of you may remember him, he was at 1% in the polls today, and he went on. He got clobbered by Mondale in Iowa. Mondale got 40%. Gary got 16%. He went into New Hampshire and won. John Kerry was nowhere, and then he became our nominee because he did well in Iowa, did well in New Hampshire. And there are people, that I wouldn't want to be one of the leading candidates in this race. I can assure you of that, because if history is any guide, none of them stands a chance of winning. It's the people that get in and can continue to build momentum that actually go on to win the race, and that's what I intend to do.
On immigration, you were a sponsor of the original DREAM Act. You were also part of the Gang of 8 that wanted to get those reforms done. But as long as I've been alive, nothing has been done on immigration. Nothing. Tell the truth now, this is a problem that will never be solved because no one wants to do anything serious about it.
Hey man, when I was thinking about running for president, my daughter Caroline, we've got 3 daughters, she's 20, she said, "Dad, if you run and tell the truth and you lose, no one can fault you for it." And I said, well, that's good, Caroline, because there's no other reason for me to run, and there's no other way for me to win. And actually the Des Moines Register about 2 months ago, had an editorial after we did the editorial board there, and the headline was, "Michael Bennet pounds truth into this campaign." And I couldn't have been prouder than to show that to my daughter. And on immigration, here's the truth. The Gang of Eight bill is the right way to do this. It got 68 votes in the Senate. We had, just to remind everybody here of the basic elements of it, it had a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million people that are here that are undocumented over a 10 to 13 year old period, 10 to get a green card, 3 more to get citizenship. You had to learn English and you had to pass 2 background checks. We had the most progressive DREAM Act that had ever been written as part of that bill. That passed with 68 votes. We had $46 billion of border security in the bill, but we didn't have the rinky-dink wall that Mexico was supposed to pay for. We had 21st century security that would allow us to look at every single inch of the border, would allow us to know who had come here lawfully, which is the way 40% of the people that are undocumented came here and overstayed their visas, so that we could know who we wanted to have stay and who we wanted to have go. We had all the agricultural stuff that anybody could have wanted. It's the only immigration bill that's ever been endorsed by all the growers in the country and the farm workers union. That's never happened before. It was endorsed by the AFL-CIO and by the Chamber of Commerce. The reason it's not law is the reason that's why our democracy is broken, and all of you need to pay attention to this. For the last 10 years, and it's why I'm running, for the last 10 years, we have been tyrannized by a group of people in Washington who went there at the beginning of the Obama administration. They call themselves the Tea Party or the Freedom Caucus, and that's an ironic name. It should be, because they believe they have a monopoly on wisdom and that they're right and the rest of us are un-American. And we have to beat these people because they were the ones who hid behind this House rule called the Hastert Rule, which you may have heard of. It's named for somebody who's actually in prison today. And it is a rule that requires no bill go to the floor of the Senate unless you have a majority of a majority, in this case a majority of Republicans, to pass the bill, which meant that a minority of Republicans could veto our legislation. And that's un-American, that's undemocratic, that's not what the founders would have wanted us to be doing, and it has denied the American people the ability to address the immigration issues that you have not seen fixed in your lifetime. But the list is long of things that need to be addressed, from immigration to climate to health care to the economic inequality that we have as a country. And as long as that cast of characters is in there determining whether we get to move forward or not as a country, we will lose. And that's why we need to beat them. And that's why these elections are so important. And I want to say this, Sarah Palin's cartoon version of what the founding fathers were engaged in when they created this country is not the same thing as what they actually were engaged in when they created the country. And that's what these guys have been spouting for the last 10 years, and we got to tell them to knock it off.
So we've been giving the candidates that come through for our Pints Politics series a 90-second question, an opportunity to lay out their 100-day plan in 90 seconds. That's less than a second per day, but we are going to time you.
Okay.
So keep it and go right ahead. Your 100-day plan.
I would reverse the Trump tax bill and pass the American Family Act to cut childhood poverty by 40%. I would send to Congress a series of reforms to clean up our broken government that included getting money out of our politics and putting people back in, addressing Citizens United, banning political gerrymandering in this country, banning members of Congress from ever becoming lobbyists when they retire, making sure that every eligible American who has the right to vote actually can cast that vote. So it would be that series of reforms. And on day one, I would start to move us past the freaking climate denial that we're dealing with in the White House right now, to gather together the people we need so that we don't dishonor ourselves any more than we already have in front of our kids and our grandkids, and we actually take on this issue of climate. And I have actually been the person who has put out a specific 90-day plan for dealing with that. That's less than 90 seconds.
Yes. 1 minute. Very impressive.
Fewer than 90 seconds.
and South Carolina are very much pro-gun states. The frequency of gun violence is increasing. There was even a shooting just last night in Kansas City. What's your plan to address what's happening now, especially with the military-style weapons in private hands?
I stayed right across from the Mother Manual last night, and it's always an amazing thing to see something in person that you've only seen in television. Very, very moving. And we got to address it. My kids, as I said, are 20, 19, and 15, and the oldest was born just after the Columbine shooting, which was one of the first high school shootings in the country. It was in my state, and we've grown up. They've grown up knowing that they're at risk going to school and feeling like they're at risk going to school, and at the same time knowing that the federal government has done absolutely nothing to deal with it. As you pointed out, we're a pro-Second Amendment state. We're a Western state. But in Colorado, we passed the background checks that Mitch McConnell won't bring to the floor almost 20 years ago. 20 years ago. And as a result of what we passed, every year, 2 or 3% of the people that try to buy a firearm in Colorado can't buy it because they're murderers or they're rapists or they're domestic abusers. I mean, and for 10 years, I've gone to Florida Senate. Tell me, why does a single person, why are you fighting so hard for these people to have guns? How can you come here and not argue that Colorado is safer as a result of what we passed, and the country would be safer if what we passed? So that's where I think our focus should be. I also would be for, limiting the size of magazines, because I don't think anybody in this country needs to be carrying a 100-round, magazine. But where we really should focus our attention right now is on the background checks, because this is what McConnell does. He loves to avoid any accountability or responsibility. And the people he's really accountable to is, unfortunately, on this issue, the NRA. So he looks to obscure everything by saying, we're trying to take everybody's guns away. A background check, by definition, has nothing to do with taking anybody's gun away, because it's the beginning of the process. I think we should stay focused on it. We should be on it every single week between now and November. And if McConnell doesn't put it on there, we have to make it a voting issue in November. It's the only way we'll be able to overcome the NRA.
All right, here's a variation of an audience question. Colorado now is now deep into the marijuana experiment. It's no longer an experiment. It's a tax base now. Based on what you know and the way it's been implemented into the state, is the outcome good or bad so far?
I thought the question was going to be, did you bring any marijuana with you? And I didn't bring any. I find that people are always going through my pockets wherever I go. Look, we were one of the early states to do it. If we had a vote on it today, the vote would reaffirm what we did with legalization easily. It is embedded in our economy. There are 3,000 people that work in the industry. There are 3,000 actually small businesses that are in the industry. We've had about $6 billion in sales and $1 billion in tax revenue collected. It hasn't all been perfect. As a parent, as somebody who is a school superintendent, I worry a lot about adolescents getting their hands on marijuana, because one thing we know for sure is that when your brain is developing, that's not a time that you want to be messing around with that stuff. And so when you've got a case where kids can't distinguish between a jelly bean that has THC in it and one that doesn't, that's a huge problem. We've now fixed that problem, but it took us a while to do it. We still have issues with the banking because, even though we've said this is legal, it's a Schedule I drug nationally, which no matter what anybody thinks about anything, that strikes me as completely counterproductive. But one of the results of that is that it's very hard for folks to have their businesses banked because they're worried that they might lose, the banks are worried they'll lose their federal charter if they transact. But there are now, I think, 33 states or so that have some form of legalization, and I think it's just a matter of time. Before we start to address these issues, the House of Representatives just last week passed the banking bill that we've all been working on for marijuana by more than 300 votes. I mean, my gosh, nothing passes the House with more than 300 votes, and almost half the Republicans voted for it, which tells you something about how unbelievable the change has been here.
All right, we're nearing the end now. We're going to wrap up pretty soon, but just a couple of housekeeping things. We want you all to stick around and call some friends in for Tulsi Gabbard, who's coming here in the next hour or so. There's one Tulsi over there, two Tulsi.
Hi, guys.
Also on Tuesday, we'll be back here again for Marianne Williamson, and that's at 5 o'clock, so tell your friends and come on back for that as well. But what we're going to do is we're going to go to our lightning round, and then we're going to give the senator a couple minutes of closing time, and then we'll wrap this up. So first question is tough. Elway or Manning?
Manning.
Oh.
Why?
Just because I was there for more of that. and also John, you know, we got issues with the team right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brady. Our food critic, Hannah Raskin, earlier in the campaign season created a challenge for all of the candidates to try out a bunch of different South Carolina foods, including barbecue, including boiled peanuts, including chicken bog, a whole bunch of different items that are specific to South Carolina, and you are way ahead of the entire pack on that challenge. You have embraced it far more than any other candidate. I've been with you at some of the stops where you've had some of these. So we do have a tough question now that you have tried so many. What has been your favorite South Carolina food item that you've had on one of your trips here?
I would say any time that I have fish and grits on the same plate, I'm a happy person. So that's what I like. But I just had, what's the name of the place around the corner? Leon's. Yeah, I got, right before I came over here, I got their seafood platter. So I had fried fish, fried shrimp. May not have eaten it all, so you guys, fried oysters. I love the food here. My wife Susan is from Marianna, Arkansas, which is a town in the Mississippi Delta. We had our wedding down there, and I know it's not the same food as here. I don't mean to suggest that it is, but the catering was done by the guy that had the muffler shop. He made the fish, and then the barbecue was this guy named Mr. Jones. And I went to see Mr. Jones, and I said, "What do you need me to do?" He literally had dug out a pit in his backyard, and which has not stopped him from being a James Beard recognized barbecue guy. And I said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "I don't need anything from you except you need to go to the Food Lion and buy 200 pounds of Boston butt and bring it over here, and I'll take care of the rest." It was the best wedding food that any of the people that I knew from New England had ever had.
All right, and this has decided elections in this state in the past, so this is a tough one. Best barbecue sauce base: mustard, tomato, or pepper and vinegar?
I don't want to pick. I'm not stupid enough to pick. I'm not going to answer.
All right, back in your home state, a little question for you. Coors or microbreweries?
And I'm the guy that said I'd tell you the truth. It depends. If I'm pushing my lawnmower, I have a Coors. If I'm sitting there at night, with my wife, I'll have a microbrew. They're for different purposes.
Okay, diplomatic answer.
Just like the barbecue.
Well, you're seeking the White House, but we want you to go back in history now. If you had to pick your favorite president, who would that be and why?
I would say Abraham Lincoln, because I think that I would say that he faced the steepest challenges and had the greatest and most profound successes. And I think that his ethic and approach to the work is something that all of us need to admire and try to emulate. The idea he said over and over again during the course of that, both leading up to the Civil War, through the Civil War, and after, we can never be enemies. We must always be friends. And I think we've lost that in our political conversation completely. And if Abraham Lincoln could understand how important that sentiment was to making a democracy work, then we ought to be able to understand how important that sentiment is to making a democracy work.
And finally, to try to leave us with a little bit of bipartisanship, who is your favorite Republican Senate colleague?
I would say Lamar Alexander, who is from Tennessee and who's the chairman of the education committee there, and who was incredibly kind to me. He was the president of the University of Tennessee, a governor, senator, President Bush's education secretary, and he knew I'd been a school superintendent. And so when we rewrote the Elementary and Secondary School Act to better resolve the balance of federal versus state and local, to go back to an earlier question, he was very kind to engage me in that work, and we rewrote much of that legislation together.
All right, well, thank you. The last 2 minutes are yours.
Oh, no, great. I didn't. So here's what I would say based on the Lincoln conversation we were just having. Here's my conclusion. The founders of this country did two incredibly important things in their generation that had never been done before in human history. One was they led an armed insurrection against a colonial power. That was the Revolutionary War, which they won. The second thing they did was they wrote a constitution that would be ratified by the people that would live under that. That had never happened in human history before. They did something terrible, which is they perpetuated human slavery, and we will be with the legacy of that terrible decision for the rest of our days. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that other Americans took it upon themselves to try to right those wrongs. Frederick Douglass is my favorite example that I use when school kids come to Washington. He was born a slave, an enslaved human being in America. He fled slavery from Maryland, went to Massachusetts where he found the abolitionist movement, and the abolitionists were arguing the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. And Douglass said, "You have that exactly wrong," this self-taught person who had been a slave. "You have this exactly wrong. The Constitution is an anti-slavery document." But we're not living up to the words of the Constitution, which is the same thing Martin Luther King said the night before he was killed in Memphis, when he said, "I'm here to make sure America keeps the promise you wrote down on the page." And I think that's what the work is for all of us. And I actually believe Douglass is as much a founder as the people that wrote the Constitution. I think the women that fought so that women like my daughters have the right to vote are founders of this country. And when you get right down to it and you're trying to think about what's your role, what's your responsibility as a citizen in this democratic republic, you need to think of yourself as a founder. It is that elevated a sense of what your responsibility is, what my responsibility is. We have a guy in the White House who said, "I alone can fix it," when he was running for office, and he got elected. And that is the most unpatriotic thing and most un-American thing I think a politician could say. This is about what all of us do and how seriously we take our responsibilities as Americans. And if we follow the example of those people before us who did much harder work than we did, nobody's asking anybody here to end slavery, but they're asking somebody here to do something about Clarendon County. Nobody's asking anybody here to climb those cliffs, at Dover, to take on Hitler. All we're being asked to do is recapture this democracy so our kids can have a chance to live out the American dream. And that's what we have to do together, and that's why I'm running for president, and I'm grateful that you're here today. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
Is that okay? That's all right?